As the bright new year of 1958 opened on the motorcycling world, an updated Sportster was emerging. Well, it was emerging in America anyway. For Harley-Davidson, the rest of the world barely existed in the 1950s and 60s, so there were almost no dealerships outside the US and Canada, which meant purchasing a new Harley-Davidson for most of the world was either impossible or impossibly expensive. Even well into 1960s London, Fred Waugh, still the only dedicated Harley-Davidson dealer in Europe, said that new Harley models were so expensive they were far beyond the reach of the average motorcyclist. He therefore centred bike sales around supplying reconditioned 750cc WL models for £175. Great Britain and much of Europe was still rebuilding itself 2 decades after World War II had ended. Poverty in Britain saw many living in slums even into the 1970s, some in houses still showing bomb damage from the war. However, by 1958, things had already begun to change significantly and surprisingly quickly. Average weekly wages had nearly doubled between 1951 and 1959, and, perhaps more importantly, unemployment was very low by the end of the 1950s, which benefited even the lowliest of workers. With that, inflation and interest rates were also low, whilst manufacturing was high and set to rise even higher as the 1960s beckoned. This led to a very welcomed consumerism which enabled, for instance, car sales to double in the 1950s, and in 1959 a record total of 200,000 motorcycle licenses were issued. This could have been good news for Harley-Davidson, but, according to Fred Waugh in October 1961, the cost of a Sportster was between £650 and £737. To compare, Triumph's most expensive model was the Bonneville, and in 1963 it cost £320 8 shillings. This was less than half the price of a Sportster in Britain. So, according to one ageing British rocker, as he reminisced, no one rode a Harley in those days. For the Harley-Davidson Sportster, 1958 was a massively important year. The original 1957 Sportster XL offered a wholly unimpressive 40 horsepower. This compared to 38 horsepower for its predecessor, the side-valve model KHK. Like the Model K line, the Sportster was designed to compete with the faster, lighter, cheaper and better handling British bikes which were equipped with smaller engines. The 1950s saw the classic British 500cc parallel twins being enlarged to 650cc, which only exasperated the problem for Harley-Davidson. But once the Sportster hit the streets, it must have taken the Harley engineers about 10 minutes to realise that the potential of what they produced was enormous. The classic Harley blend of new overhead valves and old cast iron yielded an engine that was surprisingly strong. In fact, it was massively strong, potentially even intimidating. But not yet. Some sources state that the 1957 XL power unit was 42 horsepower rather than 40, but a piffling 5% difference wasn't going to make any difference at all. The Sportster needed a much bigger increase in power. Here we need to investigate the strange world of Harley-Davidson designation letters. Originally, the founders just used a number to identify the model, so the first bike eventually became identified as the 1903 Model 1. The fourth model produced, released in 1908, was therefore the Model 4. In 1909, the Model 5 was offered in various configurations denoted with a suffix letter. Harley's first V-twin was designated the Model 5D, for instance. The motor company offered 4 models in 1913, models A, B, E and G. By 1926, Harley began to introduce the 2 letters which we're especially interested in. The first is L. Here's one I prepared earlier. 1926 was the 9th year of the rather gorgeous 61 cubic inch 1000cc Model J series. One of these was the 74 cubic inch 1200cc Model JD. New for 1926 was the JD-L. The L denoted a continuation of the JD line, but was advertised with Special Sport Solo upgrades. Similarly, in 1933, the Model VL was the same as a standard Model V, but with upgraded cylinder heads, and the 1937 Model WL was a Model W with a larger cylinder head volume. Production of the Model W line ended in 1951. Thus, the additional L designation denoted a variety of mechanical and/or stylistic updates over a standard model. The Sportster, of course, carries the legendary XL designation, but in fact there never was a Model X. The official Harley histories postulate that the initial development of the Sportster continued at a tremendous pace. Perhaps significant improvements were implemented so quickly that the Sportster be warranted the fabled L designation even before it was released. Thus, the original X was never required and the Sportster became an L right from the word go. It certainly sounds nice, doesn't it? Similarly, but more excitingly, in 1926 the all-important letter H began to appear. This precious Harley-Davidson designation letter has indicated many specialties over the years, including hill climb machine for the Model F in 1926 and a solo twin configuration for the Model V 10 years later. The 1940 Model UH offered a larger 80 cubic inch 1340cc engine compared to the standard Model U. In 1937, however, while the H variant denoted a larger engine, it also marked that engine as medium compression. In 1954, the Model K became the KH, also denoting a larger engine, but with, crucially, higher compression. A year later, 3 separate models of the FL gained the H moniker, each signifying a higher compression ratio. Therefore, the way forward for the Harley-Davidson Sportster was clear. The 40 horsepower engine needed a large boost. American muscle car fans have long proclaimed the lie that there's no substitute for cubic inches, or that there's no replacement for displacement. But one of the glories of the XL engine is that the 883cc or 54 cubic inch engine survived for a full 51 of the Sportster's 65 years, only disappearing in 2022 when Harley finally killed off the Sportster. For the 1958 Sportster, the way for Harley-Davidson to deliver a larger power boost was, therefore, also clear. Internal combustion engines are essentially just pumps. They suck in gases and then blow them out again. So, to increase power, you just have to improve the plumbing. If it took Harley engineers 10 minutes to understand that their creation had enormous potential, it must have taken them about 5 minutes to realise that increasing the compression would, as Alan Girdler puts it, offer free power. The old experimental Model KL that we looked at in the previous video had aluminium alloy heads which were just not strong enough to take the increased compression. The Sportster's cast iron heads had no such problem, so the engineers increased the port sizes, with it the larger valves to match, and raised the dome of the pistons, thus increasing the all-important compression ratio. Which leaves us with only one real question. What on earth is compression ratio? I looked it up. Fortunately, it's simple enough, and all we need to do is return to our super-duper computer-aided design program. If we look at our overhead valve engine, we can see that when the piston is at the bottom of its stroke, the cylinder offers the maximum displacement. Here, it's 100 cc. Next, when the piston's at the top of its stroke, the cylinder offers the minimum volume. Here, the head volume is 20 cc. Thus, 100 divided by 20 is 5. The compression ratio is therefore stated as being 5:1. The total combustion chamber volume is 5 times the size of the head volume alone. Note that I use square ruled paper this time. This means when you look at the diagram, finally, you don't keep thinking of a willy. Doh! In 1929, Harley-Davidson introduced the new side valve D models, nicknamed the Flatheads. The base Model D offered a compression ratio of 4.3:1, for instance, and the upgraded Model DL offered a compression ratio of 5:1. These low figures result from the very poor side valve design with its huge lopsided combustion chamber top. In addition to Harley's flathead poor chamber shape, the spark plug was positioned directly above the valves, which meant the epicenter of the combustion was directly onto the valves, not the piston. The combustion therefore had to travel down and left before getting deflected off the chamber roof and finally onto the piston. This is very poor plumbing. The Sportster's overhead valve design meant that both the valves and the spark plug were positioned directly above the piston, which offered much improved plumbing, and where the combustion ignited right over the piston, exactly where it was needed. This is the configuration of nearly all modern engines. Thus, in 1957, the Sportster XL engine offered a 7.5:1 compression ratio. The very next year, that same engine offered a compression ratio of 9:1, more than double that of the original 1929 flathead. The new high-compression XL engine thus gained the coveted H moniker naturally to denote high compression, and we enter the dawn of a legend being born. For the next decade and a half, the Sportster XLH and CH flew the great Sportster flag with pride. Adverts of the day proclaimed the Sportster H to be hot, husky, handsome. Like me. Harley said the new H also offered 12% more power, which seems to be a surprisingly conservative estimate. Still, the high compression H engine was something special, yet it was still just the dawn. During development, some dealers had expressed a strong desire for a racing version of the soon-to-be Sportster. As we noted before, racing in America usually meant oval, flat-track events, so a competition bike would be akin to what we used to call a trials bike. These were like scramblers, but also used on the roads. In California especially, desert racing was hugely popular, and a stripped-down ultra-lightweight bike would be ideal. Although Harley obliged, the bike is a bit of a unicorn and never appeared in the sales charts. It was sold in tiny numbers and, it seems, was more or less a made-to-order item. It was a standard Sportster XL, where everything that could be was removed, or just chopped off like the rear mudguard. The result was the Sportster XLC. The C came to stand for competition. The XLC was a dedicated competition bike and never meant to be road legal. The potential, however, was obvious. Why not produce a competition bike, but offer it for general release? Therefore, in 1958, the Sportster line included 4 models. A humble XL as a base model, the new XLH as a touring model with high compression engine, the rather bizarre XLC as a stripped-down Sportster for competition only, and the legend itself, the Sportster XLCH. As the CH designation suggests, this was a Sportster XL stripped down for competition but with a new high compression engine. Many identify the 1958 Sportster XLCH as the greatest of all the Sportsters, and with good reason. This is the bike that marks the beginning of the legend. With a new high compression engine, XLCH also offered the now ubiquitous peanut fuel tank. This tank, surely an acquired taste if ever there was one, instantly became a Sportster trademark and remained until production stopped in November 2022, 64 years. But this 1958 model can't be considered the best Sportster because it wasn't road legal. No lights or mirrors and a straight-through exhaust. It didn't sell well, and I imagine that many of those who did buy the XLCH in 1958 mounted their own lights, and maybe even put a lollipop-style baffle in the exhaust to quieten it, at least a little bit. But it wasn't practical, and the much better equipped XLH touring version sold much better. For 1959, Harley finally got things together for the Sportster. The old low-compression engine was dropped, and with it, for 1960, the base model XL. Perhaps more importantly, the XLCH became a road-legal machine. It got lights, of a sort, and a new 2-into-1 exhaust, which included baffles, of a sort. But the XLH and the XLCH were equipped with new camshafts which further boosted horsepower, and Alan Girdler says that the superbike really starts here. Although both models sold well, it's the sporty XL-CH which became the Sportster standard bearer. With its lightning bolt red H emblazoned on the side and the unmistakable peanut tank, this is the bike which screams Sportster most loudly, and 60 years later, a 2019 XL883 still bears the same classic Sportster branding, although without the H. Even the engine cases are the same for all those years, because the final drive is on the left and the cams remain on the right, and the snail's head on the front right engine cover hides the idle gear sprocket. The 2022 Sportster is just the same Sportster as it ever was. If the 1958 high compression engine offered a modest 12% power increase, the 1959 models went further with new high lift cams, and the XLH version was now a road legal race bike. For 1960, Harley-Davidson offered only two Sportsters, the XLH for touring and the XL-CH for performance. Except for wheels and shocks, nothing much changed, and both models sold well. 1961 and 62 saw only minor changes, including the introduction of a dual seat as standard, and for the XL-CH, a dipstick. For 1963, the XL-CH Sportsters received the classic Shorty Jules exhaust, and in 1964 they got updated full-width front brake drums. Both the XLH and the XL-CH continue to sell well. So was this 1964 Sportster the greatest motorcycle in the world? Well, some would say so, and with good reason. In 1962, Cycle World magazine in America offered a comprehensive road test of the new XL-CH. They said the bike is clearly the fastest mass-produced motorcycle we've had. In comparison, the other greatest motorcycle in the world was the 1962 Triumph Bonneville. This was still a pre-unit model, meaning that the engine and gearbox were separate lumps nailed together. It offered a 650cc engine with a healthy 46 horsepower. In 1957, the humble Sportster emerged with a more modern unit construction, with the engine and gearbox as one solid entity, but it only produced a comparatively feeble 40 horsepower. Harley improved the plumbing for 1958 to increase the horsepower, and 4 years later, in 1962, further plumbing and cam improvements led Cycle World to say, "In England, the Sportster is advertised as having 47 brake horsepower, which seems a trifle conservative. We guess our test bike had about 50 brake horsepower." Clearly, the Harley-Davidson Sportster had come of age. The iconic form we've come to know and love was set and would remain for 65 years. In 1957, the Sportster XL was a bit of an also-ran, but just 5 years later, Harley-Davidson had catapulted the Sportster to a superstardom that was already the fastest mass-produced motorcycle. Only minor changes were made to the Sportster in the early 60s, but in 1965, another apparently minor change led to the XLs becoming a much more user-friendly machine. They gained a 12-volt electrical system. The Sportster XL-CH may claim to be the greatest right here, but actually this doesn't happen until 1966. In episode 4, we'll see that Harley-Davidson were just about to launch the Sportster to its ultimate, most glorious state, the most brilliant star in the motorcycling sky. In 1924, a new shop was opened on King's Road in London by Captain Frederick James Waugh. Captain Waugh sold anything he thought he could make a profit on, up to and including Harley-Davidson motorcycles. His son, Fred Waugh, left the RAF in 1949 to work with his father, but they disagreed about how the company should progress. Fred was keen to focus exclusively on Harley-Davidson, so he opened a second shop in Waterford Road just off the King's Road. Later, Fred inherited the King's Road shop, and his son John redeveloped the site into the 20,000 square foot purpose-built dealership it is today. In 2003, a second dealership was opened in Mottingham Road, south-east London. The Harley-Davidson Riders Club of Great Britain is the oldest Harley club in the land. The Venerable Paul is club archivist and secretary, and who's been a club member for half a century. Apart from explaining to me the difference between a suicide clutch and a seesaw clutch, he's also been a personal friend to Fred Waugh. In the autumn, I was on YouTube watching an episode of Motorcycle News' Weekly Wind-On. I was very sad to hear that Fred Waugh had passed away. From what Paul says, it seems that Fred was a lovely chap and a passionate Harley-Davidson fan. Fred's passing will, I'm sure, be a great sorrow for the family. I believe Fred Waugh must be the nicest and most important British biker that I never met. Godspeed to you, Fred, and my deepest sympathies to your family.